The day had begun like any other in the bustling studio of the Steve Harvey Show. Camera operators ran last-minute checks. The stage crew set up props with a quiet urgency, and makeup artists dabbed foreheads and adjusted collars as the clock ticked toward showtime. Backstage, Steve Harvey paced slowly, rehearsing the intro in his head, oblivious to the storm of emotion that would soon sweep him off his feet. For him, it was just another feel-good episode, an audience-pleasing hour of television packed with laughs, life lessons, and maybe a few tears from the guests. What he didn't know was that this time, he'd be the one caught off guard. The show's theme was Everyday Heroes, a favorite of Steve's. He loved spotlighting ordinary people doing extraordinary things. It was one of the ways he felt he could give back, by putting the spotlight on the humble, the overlooked, the brave souls who never asked for fame, but deserved it more than most. The producers, knowing this, had carefully crafted the episode to appear normal. In fact, everything had been scripted to hide one truth. Steve wasn't the one giving the tribute. He was receiving it. As the countdown began, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, the familiar musical intro hit, and the studio audience erupted with applause. Steve strode confidently onto the stage, arms wide, that signature mustache framed by a beaming grin. Dressed in a deep navy suit with a maroon tie and shining black shoes, he looked every bit the star. He welcomed the audience with his usual charm, cracking a few quick jokes that had the crowd in stitches. "Y'all better give me that kind of applause when I come home from the grocery store," he quipped. The vibe was warm, easy, comforting. "We got a special show today, folks," he said, clasping his hands together. "We talking about real heroes. Not the ones you see flying through the sky wearing capes. No, I'm talking about the kind that walk among us every day. The ones who serve, protect, and give without a skin for a thing in return." The first guest was a firefighter from Ohio who had rescued 3 children from a burning building. Steve treated him with genuine admiration, thanking him for his bravery. Listening intently as he recounted the moment, he heard the screams inside the smoke-filled home. Steve wiped away a tear, though he joked, "These ain't real tears. I got allergies." The audience laughed, but they could tell he meant every word. The segment ended with a standing ovation, and Steve walked back to center stage, ready for the next guest. But then, something changed. The band played a different chord progression, slower, more dramatic. The lighting dimmed slightly, just enough to shift the tone. Steve squinted toward the cameras, puzzled. "Hold up now," he said. "This ain't how we rehearsed this." From a control booth, producers whispered into headsets, their hands slightly trembling. The crew moved in tighter around the monitors. They'd planned this for weeks, down to the second. The surprise had to land just right. Steve turned to face the massive LED screen behind him, which usually displayed graphics or video intros. But this time, it flickered ominously before settling on a live video feed. A log cabin interior filled the screen, rustic, sun-dappled, simple. And standing in the center, unmistakable, was Chuck Norris. The audience gasped audibly. Steve froze, hands in his pockets, staring at the screen like he'd just seen a ghost. "No way," he murmured, lips barely moving. "Is that Chuck Norris?" Chuck wore a denim shirt tucked into a leather belt, sleeves rolled just enough to show forearms that still hinted at power, even in his 70s. His face was as stoic as ever, but there was a warmth in his eyes, a kind of quiet vulnerability that fans rarely saw. This wasn't the meme-worthy, roundhouse-kicking Chuck. This was the real man behind the legend. He looked directly into the camera and said, "Steve, you don't know me personally, but I know you." Steve's eyebrows shot up. "Wait, what?" he muttered. He took a step back, glancing toward the wings of the stage. The studio was eerily quiet now. No one wanted to miss a word. Chuck continued, "You've made a career making people laugh. You've inspired millions with your honesty, your faith, your work ethic. But there's one moment I'll never forget, and you don't even know about it." Steve sat down slowly in his chair, hands folded in his lap, trying to process what was happening. Chuck Norris was talking to him. Not about karate, not about movies or jokes, but about him, Steve Harvey. And the look in Chuck's eyes wasn't casual. It was serious. It was grateful. Chuck's voice was calm, deliberate. Years ago, I watched an episode of your show with a young man who had just come out of prison. You didn't shame him. You encouraged him. You said, your past doesn't define your future. I was watching with my nephew that day. He'd been in trouble. He felt like there was no way forward. But you spoke hope into that boy's life through a screen. And Steve, he turned his life around. That young man is now a father, a business owner, and the reason I'm here today. Steve's face contorted in disbelief, his mouth slightly agape, eyes glistening. The audience was completely still. You could have heard a pin drop. Chuck took a breath, then added, my family owes you something we can never repay. So this message is personal. The screen went dark for a second. Steve stood, instinctively stepping forward as if drawn to the screen itself. What in the world is going on? He whispered. Suddenly, the screen lit up again, and this time it showed a montage of clips. Steve talking to struggling fathers, hugging crying mothers, offering jobs, giving scholarships. Then, a shot of a young man, clean-cut, dressed in business attire, smiling proudly in front of a storefront bearing the name Norris & Son Construction. The narration resumed. That's my nephew, Steve. That's the kid you never met, but somehow reached. And he's just one of many. Steve's hands rose to his mouth. A tear rolled down his cheek. Chuck's voice returned. Strength isn't always physical, Steve. Sometimes it's standing in front of a camera, day after day, and choosing kindness, compassion, and truth. You're one of the strongest men I've ever seen. Thank you. And with that, the screen faded to black. Steve stood alone in the spotlight, overcome. His chest rose and fell with deep, uneven breaths. The audience erupted, some clapping, others crying. But Steve said nothing. He simply covered his face with his hands, the weight of the moment pressing down like a tidal wave. For once, the man who always knew what to say was speechless. The studio had never felt this quiet. Even the whirring of the cameras seemed muffled, as if the machinery itself was holding its breath. Steve Harvey stood in the glow of the spotlight, unmoving, arms hanging loosely by his side, the last few words from Chuck Norris still ringing in his ears. You're one of the strongest men I've ever seen. There was a long silence. Steve turned his back to the audience for a moment, wiping his eyes with the edge of his jacket sleeve. When he turned back, he was clearly rattled. Man, he whispered, his voice cracked and uneven. Y'all didn't tell me this was gonna be that kind of show. Laughter, light, warm, rippled through the audience, a small release valve for the tension. But everyone knew this wasn't over. The screen flickered again, and Chuck reappeared, this time sitting down. The log cabin behind him was softly lit, and a framed photo of a young man rested on a table beside him, the same young man from the montage. Chuck picked up the photo, held it for a moment, then placed it back down. His eyes met the camera, full of something rarely seen in him, vulnerability. I've spent my life building strength, he said. Discipline, courage, control. But I've learned, especially in these later years, that real strength doesn't come from fighting. It comes from caring. Steve's lips pressed into a thin line, eyes glassy. He nodded slowly, absorbing each word. Chuck continued. You've shown strength in a way most people overlook. The way you talk to people, Steve. You look them in the eye. You see them. You don't care if they're broke, if they're famous, if they've been to prison, or made mistakes. You treat everyone like they matter. That's rare. The audience remained utterly silent. People were holding hands now. A few wiped tears from their cheeks. The man on stage, the entertainer, the mentor, the public figure, had suddenly become us, stripped of his role, raw in his humanity. Chuck leaned forward. There's something I haven't told you yet, he said. That young man, my nephew, he wanted to be here today, but he couldn't make it. You know why? Chuck's voice trembled just slightly. He's out volunteering. He says if you taught him anything, it's that giving is the way to healing. Steve smiled, tenderly, tearfully. Chuck went on, his voice growing softer. I used to think my legacy was action movies, martial arts championships. But legacies aren't what you leave on screen. They're what you leave in people. My nephew's legacy started because of your words. And that's why I had to do this. The video shifted again, this time to a home video. Shaky footage showed a small family backyard gathering. There was the nephew again, standing by a grill, holding a toddler on his hip, laughing. He looked full, centered. The voiceover resumed, this time Chuck narrating off-screen. We live in a world obsessed with strength, but we forget how powerful kindness is. Steve, I've watched you offer second chances, speak God's name on national TV when others were scared to, and teach young men how to walk like kings when they've been treated like criminals. That takes guts. That's heroism. Steve's shoulders dropped slightly, overwhelmed. The weight of years of shows, of unspoken impact, of lives touched, now all being reflected back at him by someone who, in many ways, embodied the ideal of masculine strength. That kind of praise from Chuck Norris? It wasn't just flattery. It was validation. People ask me all the time, Chuck's voice went on, who are your heroes? I usually say my brother, my martial arts mentors, veterans. But today, you're one of them, Steve. At that, Steve visibly broke. He turned away from the audience, hands to his face, body trembling. A deep, almost primal sob escaped his chest, a sound few had ever heard from him. It wasn't performative. It wasn't for the cameras. This was a man undone by the power of gratitude. The audience stood, without cue, and began to applaud. Not loud or raucous, but slow, intentional, respectful. It was a kind of spiritual moment, a communal acknowledgement that something sacred had just occurred. When Steve finally turned back, his eyes were red, his tie loosened. He looked smaller somehow, not in stature, but in the way a man does when his heart has been seen, fully, lovingly, without defense. He stepped up to the microphone, blinking back more tears. I don't even know what to say, he began. I've been doing this show for a long time, and I've had moments, big ones. Oprah, Obama, families reunited, soldiers coming home. But this, he paused, gripping the microphone stand. This right here, this is something else. Because Chuck Norris just told me I'm a hero. Me, a kid who grew up with nothing in Cleveland. A boy who stuttered, who failed school, who didn't think he was worth nothing. And now look, a lump formed in his throat, and he swallowed hard. I don't do this for fame, he continued. I've already been famous. I don't do it for the money. God's blessed me. I do it because I know what it feels like to be invisible, to feel like you ain't got a voice. And if I could be the one person who sees somebody, that's all I need. The screen flickered one last time. Chuck appeared again, smiling. You're not invisible, Steve, he said. You're unforgettable, and the world a better place because you're in it. The crowd erupted into cheers, this time louder, more jubilant. The band struck a soulful note, and Steve just stood there, nodding, eyes wet, a smile breaking through the storm of emotions. Behind the scenes, even the crew members, many of whom had worked on hundreds of shows, were visibly moved. One producer whispered, "This is the most real thing we've ever aired." Steve finally looked into the camera. To everybody out there watching, I just want to say, never doubt your value. You might not think anyone's watching, but somebody is. And the seeds you plant today, man, you got no idea who they're going to grow into tomorrow. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, dabbing at his cheeks. Then, pointing at the screen with a trembling hand, he added, "And to Chuck Norris, next time you make a man cry, send tissues first." Laughter burst through the emotional fog, and Steve winked, returning, briefly, to his usual self. But something had shifted. The armor had cracked. The legend had been humbled by another. And in that moment, the world didn't see a talk show host or a martial artist. They saw two men, stripped of ego, bound by respect, connected by the invisible thread of goodness. And the tears Steve Harvey shed that day, they weren't about sadness. They were about purpose, about impact, about being seen, and finally understanding the ripple he'd created in the lives of others. When the show returned from its final commercial break, there was a different energy in the air, softer, quieter, reverent. The set felt more like a sanctuary than a soundstage. Gone was the usual light-hearted banter, the punchy music cues, the playful crowd chatter. What remained was an unmistakable stillness, as if the very room understood that something sacred had just passed through it. Steve Harvey sat at the edge of the stage now, no longer standing behind his host's desk or pacing in front of the monitors. His jacket was unbuttoned, and his tie had been loosened around his neck. His shoulders had relaxed, but his eyes still glistened with emotion. It wasn't the kind of showbiz emotion that flickers out once the cameras stop. This was something deeper, something enduring. The audience sat down with him, literally and emotionally. For once, the viewers weren't being entertained. They were being invited into something rare, a genuine, unscripted moment of vulnerability from a man the world usually saw as ironclad. Steve took a long breath before speaking. "I just want to take a minute if y'all don't mind," he said softly, his voice a little hoarse, "because I don't think I've ever felt this way on this stage before." He looked out over the audience, not as a performer, but as a man. "We do a lot of shows here. Some are funny, some are deep, some are just plain wild," he chuckled, lightly shaking his head. "But this what just happened with Chuck Norris. I'm gonna remember this for the rest of my life." He paused. The audience nodded, some wiping their own eyes, others resting their hands over their hearts. "You know," Steve continued, "I've met a lot of people in my time. Presidents, athletes, kings and queens of this entertainment game. But for Chuck Norris to take the time to honor me, that's something I could have never predicted." He chuckled again, but the laughter didn't last. Steve leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I need y'all to understand something about me," he said. "I come from nothing. I was homeless. Slept in my car. I ain't have no plan B. God was my only plan. And when you come from where I come from, you don't expect to be seen. Not like this." He looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers slightly. "When I first got into comedy, I wasn't trying to be a role model. I just wanted to eat, pay some bills. But over the years, people started telling me that what I said mattered, that it helped them, that it gave them hope." He looked up, locking eyes with the front row. "That's a responsibility, man. That's a gift and a burden all wrapped up in one. Because once you know you're reaching people, you can't unknow it. You got to show up different. You got to be better." One of the audience members shouted softly, "You are better." The crowd murmured in agreement. Steve nodded, visibly moved. "Thank you. But I don't say this for praise. I say it because there's somebody out there right now, watching this, thinking they don't matter. Thinking their story don't mean nothing. And I'm here to tell you, it does. You don't know who's watching you. You don't know who's taking notes on how you carry yourself." He pointed toward the now blank video screen. Chuck Norris was watching me. Chuck Norris, the man who beat up 100 guys at once in the movies. He laughed, shaking his head. And here he was, thanking me for being a role model. Man, the crowd clapped gently, their energy grounded and respectful. Steve continued, his tone quieter now. "When I saw that young man, Chuck's nephew, when I saw him running his business, holding his baby, living clean, it hit me. Because that could have been me. That was me, just a kid trying to find his way." He swallowed hard. "When I talk on this show, I'm not just talking to the camera. I'm talking to that version of me that didn't know if he was gonna make it. I'm talking to the 17-year-old who's sitting in juvie, or the single mama who's working 3 jobs and still feeling invisible. I see you. I really do." Behind the scenes, producers watched silently from the control room. One of them, a seasoned veteran with decades of daytime TV under his belt, whispered, "This is the realest moment we've ever had on air." Back on stage, Steve straightened up, his eyes scanning the audience. "People think tears mean weakness," he said. They don't. Tears mean release. Tears mean you've been holding something too long, and God finally made space to let out." He gave a small smile. "And sometimes you need a roundhouse-kicking cowboy to help you do that." The crowd laughed again, a little louder now, but still filled with warmth. It was the kind of laughter that comes after a good cry, the laughter that says we're healing together now. Steve clasped his hands. "I just want to say thank you to every person who's ever said something kind to me, to every person who's let me speak into their life. And to Chuck Norris, man, I don't even have words. You honored me more than you know." He looked directly into the camera. "And to that young man out there, the one who don't believe in himself just yet, I want you to hear me. You matter. You matter so much. Don't give up. Don't quit. Just keep showing up. One day, somebody's gone tell your story, and you won't even believe how far you've come. As he spoke, a still image of Chuck Norris and his nephew faded onto the screen behind him. Underneath it, in bold white letters, appeared the words, "Strength is not what you show. It's what you share." The audience rose to their feet again, this time in a thunderous standing ovation. But Steve didn't move to end the show. He just stood there with them, tears dried now, posture firm, eyes filled with something new, peace. Finally, he raised his hand. "Let's go out with love today," he said. "Take what you saw here and go speak life into somebody. Because the world don't need more noise. It needs more heart." With that, the band began to play a soulful instrumental version of "Lean on Me." The credits rolled over footage of Steve hugging audience members, greeting the crew, and stepping off the stage into the arms of his family waiting just behind the curtain. And long after the cameras stopped, the lights dimmed, and the studio emptied out, people were still talking. Not about ratings, not about celebrity gossip, but about what it meant to see a strong man break down and be made even stronger through it. Viewers across the country sent messages. Veterans, teachers, ex-convicts, single mothers, pastors, teenagers, all of them echoed the same sentiment. "Thank you. I needed that." And Steve Harvey, he went home that night not as a host, not as a brand, but as a man reminded that even when you're on top of the world, the deepest impact comes when your heart stays close to the ground. That episode would go down not just as one of the most powerful in his show's history, but as a moment where two men, built by entirely different journeys, met in the middle of a quiet truth. Real strength is love, spoken out loud.